On the night of November 13th, 1974, a 28-year-old nuclear plant worker left her home carrying documents that she believed would expose serious safety concerns at a plutonium facility. She told people that she was meeting a union representative and a reporter, but she never arrived. Now, hours later, her car was found wrecked on a rural Oklahoma highway. The official explanation was simple: a single car accident. Just one hitch. When investigators examined her case, nothing about this was simple. In the days before her death, radioactive plutonium was found not just on her body, but on her clothes, in her car, and inside her apartment. The company she worked for said that it was a tragic accident. Federal investigators couldn't explain how it happened. The documents she said that she was carrying were never found, and no one could agree on whether her crash was caused by fatigue, contamination, maybe something else entirely. I'm John Genoa, and you're watching America's Strangest History. Her name was Karen Silkwood. This is a story of what she uncovered and why nearly 50 years later, the case still smells kind of fishy. Karen Silkwood was 28 years old. She wasn't a journalist or a lawyer or a professional activist. Karen was a chemical technician working the night shift at a nuclear fuel fabrication plant in Oklahoma owned by Kerr-McGee. Now, Karen's job placed her inside one of the most dangerous industrial processes in the country, the production of plutonium fuel rods. Now, this wasn't a theoretical risk. Plutonium is intensely radioactive. It's toxic in microscopic quantities and unforgiving of mistakes. Handling it safely depends on strict procedures, intact containment systems, and accurate record keeping. Now, Karen was also a member of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. Now, through that union, she served on safety committees and participated in inspections. Her dual roles meant that she had access not just to her own workstation, but to contamination reports, inspection logs, and internal safety documentation. People who worked with her described her as outspoken, direct, and persistent. Karen wasn't known for exaggeration. She didn't quietly accept unsafe conditions, and when something looked wrong, she asked questions and she wrote things down. By 1974, Karen started raising concerns about dangerous conditions at the plant. And these weren't vague complaints. They involved specific processes and paperwork. Things like whether glove boxes were functioning properly, whether radiation alarms were being ignored, and whether quality control checks were actually being recorded accurately. Now, what troubled her the most was the gap between what workers experienced on the floor and what the company was reporting to regulators. Now, according to testimony and later investigations, some inspection records appeared altered or backdated. Safety checks that should have halted production were sometimes logged as completed. Karen didn't take these concerns public right away. She followed internal channels. She raised the issues with her union officials. She participated in meetings. She assumed that the system would correct itself if the problems were documented cleanly enough. Now, that assumption couldn't have been more wrong. By the fall of 1974, Karen was no longer just reporting problems. She was posing a problem. Inside the plant, she was known as someone who wouldn't let issues drop. And union officials recognized that she had firsthand knowledge of practices few outsiders could see. And this is where the story changes direction. Up to this point, Karen Silkwood's life fits a familiar pattern. A worker inside a dangerous industry raises concerns through official channels, expecting oversight to function as designed. But what happened next would push her case beyond workplace dispute and into a category no one involved could fully explain. By early 1974, Karen Silkwood was no longer just noticing problems at the Kerr-McGee plant. She was documenting them. The Cimarron facility was producing plutonium fuel rods. It's a process that depended on a multitude of safety precautions, things like sealed glove boxes, filtration systems, and constant monitoring, to name three. Any breach of these could expose workers to radioactive material that would remain in their bodies for the rest of their lives. So the safety is pretty important here. Karen began recording repeated contamination incidents. Those glove boxes failed. Alarms sounded and were reset, and production just continued. What troubled her the most wasn't that accidents happened, because accidents do happen. Even with rock-solid precautions, accidents are going to happen. And for Karen, it wasn't the accident so much as it was the paperwork that didn't match reality. According to union testimony and later congressional records, safety logs showed inspections completed when equipment was still malfunctioning. Now, quality control forms were filled out retroactively. Failed fuel pellets were marked as acceptable. This isn't safe. It's reckless. Karen raised these issues internally. She brought them to union safety committees and assumed regulators would intervene once they were notified. But inside the plant, her name was becoming associated more with the problem and less as a problem solver. Now, co-workers later testified that she was pressured to back off. Management disputed her claims and maintained that procedures were being followed. The company's position was consistent here. Contamination was under control and records were accurate. Nothing to see here, move on. But Karen didn't accept that. She continued to document incidents and worked with union officials to escalate her concerns beyond the plant. And by fall of 1974, this morphed from a quiet labor dispute to a full-on federal matter. And then, without warning, the focus shifted from paperwork to something far more personal. In November, Karen Silkwood tested positive for plutonium contamination, a tragic accident. Tragic coincidence? Well, at first, Kerr-McGee said that the exposure must have occurred at work, but it didn't take long for that explanation to begin to unravel. In November 1974, Karen Silkwood crossed a line that no one involved was prepared for. Routine tests showed that Karen had been contaminated with plutonium. These weren't symptoms Karen noticed on her own. The contamination was discovered through routine urine analysis tests conducted at the plant. When the first test came back positive, Kerr-McGee ordered follow-up testing, and the levels increased over several days. Now, at first, Kerr-McGee treated it as an occupational exposure. This wasn't unheard of in a nuclear facility. Workers occasionally tested positive after equipment failures or procedural mistakes. The company's initial explanation was that Karen must have been contaminated inside the plant. Simple as that. It's tragic, but not totally unheard of. But that explanation began to collapse almost immediately. Follow-up testing showed plutonium not just on Karen's skin, but on her clothing. Then it showed up in her car. They even found it inside her apartment. Now, investigators detected plutonium contamination in multiple rooms of Karen's home. In her kitchen, on food containers, in her refrigerator. Also on household surfaces that had no connection to her job or her work or her clothes. Now, that's very unusual. Let me be very clear about one thing. This wasn't a matter of radioactive dust on her work clothes being carried home inadvertently, because that's the first place my mind went. But if we look closer, a pattern doesn't seem to fit. Federal investigators were brought in. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission and other agencies tried to reconstruct how plutonium could have been spread from the plant into a private residence. And guess what? They couldn't. Federal investigators acknowledged that the contamination was real, but they couldn't identify a source, a mechanism, or a single event that explained how plutonium entered her home. Their reports repeatedly used phrases like, "cannot be conclusively determined," and "no definitive source identified." How does this look for an accidental transfer theory? Well, contaminated gloves or materials are mishandled. This allows microscopic particles to travel. Sounds pretty reasonable on paper. Too bad it doesn't actually work out that way. Another theory is systemic failure. Safety controls of the plant were so poor that contamination became widespread and invisible. But again, problems. Records show that on at least one of the days Karen tested positive, she wasn't even assigned to work areas where plutonium exposure should have occurred. Yet the contamination levels increased anyway, so the logs didn't line up with the test results. Later commenters and whistleblowers claimed that the contamination appeared after her shifts ended. Now, this suggests it wasn't happening where Kerr-McGee said it was. The claims were never proven in court, but they don't look too good. Karen herself became increasingly alarmed. I mean, who wouldn't? She told her friends and her union officials that she felt unsafe, and not just at work, but at home. She worried about what the contamination meant for her health and for whether she was being used as an example to discourage other workers from speaking out. Now, there's no clear evidence that Karen was suffering from acute radiation sickness at this stage. It's not surprising. Plutonium exposure doesn't cause immediate visible illness. It creates long-term cancer risk, not instant collapse, like cancer or organ damage. Psychologically, the effect was immediate. Karen was living with the knowledge that radioactive material, one of the most dangerous substances on Earth, entered her body and her home, and no one could explain how. Kerr-McGee denied any wrongdoing. The company insisted its safety systems were functioning properly and that any containment issue was accidental or limited. Now, federal investigators acknowledged problems at the plant, but they couldn't trace the contamination to a specific act or failure. So no one was charged, no one was disciplined, and the most important question remained unanswered. How did plutonium get into Karen Silkwood's apartment? If the contamination wasn't accidental, if it didn't come from routine work exposure, then it means something else happened, something more serious. Karen began to believe that what she'd uncovered at the plant went beyond paperwork and faulty equipment. She believed someone wanted what she knew to stay hidden, and it was that belief that would shape her next move. By the time Karen Silkwood learned that plutonium was found inside her apartment, her situation changed in ways that went beyond workplace safety. According to colleagues and union officials, Karen started expressing specific concerns that she was being watched and pressured. She told police that she believed phone calls were being monitored. She noticed unfamiliar cars near her home and along her routes. At work, she felt isolated. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms, and she believed management now viewed her as a liability. Now, it's important to be clear about what comes next. Much of what we know about this period comes from later testimony, recordings, and recollections. Some of this material was made or collected years or even decades after. Now, these accounts were never tested in criminal court, so they aren't proof. But they help explain why those close to Karen believed that she felt she was under threat. That being said, in interviews recorded after the civil trial, former law enforcement officers and union figures claimed that Karen was under informal surveillance, not necessarily by federal agents. In her case, it was individuals connected to the plant security or even local authorities. Now, some allege that off-duty officers were used to keep an eye on her movements. It's a sobering thought. There's also claims, again unproven, that warnings were issued within law enforcement to limit response to incidents involving Karen. Now, there's no documentation to conclusively establish this. What does exist is a pattern of concern among those around her that something about the situation became abnormal. Karen's behavior reflects that belief. She started collecting documents more urgently: internal records, safety logs, inspection reports. She told union representatives that she had evidence showing systemic problems at the plant, and that those problems were being covered up. She also worried that the contamination itself might not have been accidental. Go figure. That belief isn't supported by direct proof, so let's be clear about that. But it's consistent with the facts as she knew them. Plutonium appeared in places that no one could explain, and the company responsible offered no convincing answers. Karen reached a decision. She was going to take what she had and she was going to bring it to the public. She arranged a meeting with a union representative and a reporter from the New York Times. Now, this wasn't a casual conversation. It was an escalation, because once information reached a national newspaper, it was no longer contained by internal investigations or regulatory back and forth. No, the public eye would bring it all to light. Karen told people that she was bringing the documents with her. She left her apartment on the night of November 13th, 1974, intending to make that meeting. Now, Karen believed that the evidence would protect her, but she never arrived. On the evening of November 13th, 1974, Karen Silkwood left her apartment with a specific purpose. She told coworkers and union officials she was on her way to meet a union rep as well as a New York Times reporter. The reporter was David Burnham. He was known at the time for covering government and corporate accountability. Now, this wasn't a casual interview because an exchange of documents were planned. Records Karen believed demonstrated serious safety violations and falsified procedures at the Kerr-McGee plant. It was all arranged with her union present and a national reporter waiting. She was supposed to turn over documents she believed showed serious safety violations at the plant, but that never happened. And whatever Karen was carrying with her that night was never recovered. Now, there's no evidence she deviated from that route intentionally. She just never arrived. They discovered her car later that night wrecked along a rural highway. Emergency responders found no indication to suggest she reached her destination or contacted anyone along the way. The documents Karen said that she was carrying weren't in the vehicle. Investigators had no way to inventory what she carried with her, but union officials confirmed she'd been collecting specific safety logs and inspection records in the days leading up to the meeting. And documents weren't scattered at the scene. In fact, they were never accounted for. Now, this absence immediately raised questions. Karen was meticulous about documenting her concerns. She spoke openly about having evidence, and yet after the crash, there was no trace of the material she intended to deliver. Curious. Some later accounts, again never confirmed in court, they suggest that papers may have been seen at the scene and then removed. Now, what can be said with certainty is that the documents vanished with Karen, likely somewhere along the route if you ask me. At this point, the case split into two parallel tracks. One track focused on the work, contamination, corporate responsibility. The other focused on the crash itself. If Karen died in an accident, then the disappearance of the documents was a coincidence. A tragic coincidence, but still a coincidence. Likewise, if the documents were removed, then the crash couldn't and shouldn't be treated as an isolated event. Investigators couldn't prove either scenario here, but the timing is impossible to ignore. I mean, think about it. Karen Silkwood was carrying evidence to a national newspaper, and she died before she could deliver it. Late on the night of November 13, 1974, Karen Silkwood's car left the roadway on a rural highway near Crescent, Oklahoma, and struck a concrete culvert. Now, it's a drainage structure along the highway, for those that don't know. The impact was violent enough to be fatal, even without a collision with another vehicle. Emergency responders arrived to find Karen Silkwood dead at the scene. Now, from the beginning, authorities treated the incident as a single-car accident. The initial conclusion was that Karen fell asleep at the wheel and then somehow drifted off the road and crashed. But almost immediately, that explanation began to face scrutiny. Investigators noted damage consistent with a vehicle leaving the roadway at speed. Now, there are no signs of another car at the scene and no obvious debris from a collision. Also, no eyewitnesses to the crash itself. Toxicology tests showed trace amounts of Quaaludes in Karen's system. Now, at the time, this was cited as a possible factor in impaired driving or drowsiness. The presence of the drug raised immediate questions about how it entered her system and when, and on paper, the case looked closed. Independent analysts and later investigators raised several concerns here. Now, first, there's the braking evidence. Reports differed on whether there was clear skid marks or braking impressions on the roadway. Some reconstructions suggested that Karen didn't apply the brakes before the impact. This lends support to the fell asleep theory. It's possible, but there's some who suggest that the road conditions and the damage patterns made braking evidence difficult to interpret. Speaking of vehicle damage patterns, independent experts question whether the angle and the nature of the damage itself were fully consistent with simple drift off the road scenario. Because it seems pretty convenient, right? Some suggest that the damage could also be explained by contact with another vehicle, though no definitive proof of such contact was ever established. How about toxicology? Friends and coworkers stated that Karen disliked Quaaludes and never used them recreationally. They found low levels in her system. Yes, we know that. But the drug's presence raises questions about how and when the drug entered her system. There's no evidence to suggest that she was impaired earlier in the evening. Then there's the missing documents. Karen told people she was carrying papers to the meeting, but none were found in her car, and no clear inventory established whether she had them physically with her at the time of the crash. Still, their absence became impossible to ignore. Years after the accident, former law enforcement officers and investigators gave interviews and recordings in which they disputed the official reconstruction. A number of them claimed that the crash scene suggested interference, and some alleged Karen may have been followed that night. But these statements were made long after the fact. They were never tested in criminal court, and no charges resulted from them. So, as evidence, they're unproven. But as context, they explain why doubts about the crash still linger. What can be said with certainty is that no single explanation answers all the questions here. If Karen fell asleep, it doesn't explain the missing documents or the unresolved contamination. If another vehicle was involved, there's no physical evidence that conclusively proves it. Now, if drugs played a role, there's no clear account of how they were introduced or why. Each theory revolves around one piece of the puzzle and leaves another exposed. Karen Silkwood wasn't just an accident victim. She was a whistleblower carrying evidence to a national newspaper days after unexplained plutonium contamination appeared in her home. Now, that context doesn't prove foul play, but it does mean that the crash should never have been evaluated in isolation. In the end, investigators couldn't say with confidence that the crash was anything other than an accident. They also couldn't say with confidence that it was. And that unresolved tension between what could be proven and what could not became the defining feature of this case. After Karen's death, the questions surrounding her contamination and her crash didn't disappear, they multiplied. Now, federal agencies, including the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Department of Energy, conducted investigations into conditions at the Kerr-McGee plant. What they found didn't resolve the central mystery, but it did confirm something important. The plant had serious safety problems. Investigators documented a host of issues: contaminated incidents that were never fully reported, inadequate oversight of plutonium handling, and a regulatory environment that relied heavily on company self-reporting. The company was supposed to police itself, and shocker, it failed to do so. Investigators couldn't determine how plutonium entered Karen Silkwood's apartment or whether any individual act, accidental or deliberate, was responsible. Now, at the same time, Karen's family and her union pursued a civil lawsuit against Kerr-McGee. case didn't ask a criminal question. It asked a narrower but less significant one. Did the company fail in its duty to protect Karen Silkwood? In 1979, after weeks of testimony, a jury answered yes. Now, Kerr-McGee was found liable for negligence. The jury awarded damages to Karen's family, recognizing that unsafe practices at the plant exposed her to harm. Now, on appeal, the monetary award was reduced, but the core finding that the company had been negligent stood. The outcome was unusual, because corporations involved in nuclear work were rarely held accountable in court, especially without a criminal conviction. Now, the verdict acknowledged wrongdoing without explaining exactly how the worst events occurred, and congressional hearings followed. Lawmakers heard testimony that revealed confusion over jurisdiction and a regulatory system that largely relied on company self-reporting. Regulators were questioned about why warnings were missed and why oversight failed. Testimony revealed gaps in enforcement and a system that struggled to keep pace with the dangers of nuclear technology. And still, the most personal questions remain unanswered. No agency could say how Karen's home became contaminated. No investigation could account for the missing documents she said that she carried, and no official finding could state with certainty whether her crash was purely accidental or influenced by some kind of outside factor. So lots of unanswered questions. In the years that followed, Kerr-McGee continued operating, though the Cimarron plant would eventually close. The nuclear industry moved forward, changed in some ways by Silkwood's case, but not transformed by it. Karen Silkwood became something she never set out to be, a symbol of a system that can acknowledge failure without fully explaining it, a system capable of saying something went wrong while stopping short of saying who, how, or why. I'm John Genoa, and you've been watching America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.